Ever feel like you're just drowning in bad news? Every time you turn around, there's another global crisis, another reason to worry.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It really is. And it's easy to feel powerless, like how can anyone even begin to tackle these massive problems?
Right, like where do you even start?
Exactly. But that's why we're doing this deep dive. We're going beyond the headlines and into the mind of someone who's dedicated his life to actually solving these kinds of problems.
Not just talking about them, but rolling up his sleeves and finding real solutions.
Exactly. We're talking about Gregory DeBruler, and let me tell you, this guy's resume is seriously impressive. 36 years. 36 years of tackling everything from government corruption to environmental disasters.
We're talking Department of Energy, the EPA, even working directly with Native American tribes.
The guy's been everywhere. But here's the thing, it's not just the sheer range of issues he's tackled.
It's the approach. He's a certified mediator, which is huge.
Oh, tell me more about that. Why is that so important?
Well, it speaks to his ability to navigate conflict and find common ground, even in the most challenging situations.
So he's like the king of finding those win-win solutions, the things that everyone else misses.
Precisely. And that kind of thinking is crucial when you're dealing with the kind of complex global challenges that DeBruler takes on.
Absolutely. So where does all of this lead? Well, these days, DeBruler is really focused on two main areas: government reform and alternatives to war.
And he's not just sitting back and theorizing about these things. He's actively trying to make a difference with his podcast, The Conscious Hour.
The Conscious Hour, right, I've heard of that. So is it one of those podcasts where it's just a bunch of talking heads, debating back and forth without any real-world impact?
No, not at all. And that's what's so interesting about DeBruler. Remember his motto? Define the problem, identify solutions, create implementation plans.
So it's all about action, actually doing something.
That's exactly it. And the Conscious Hour is like an extension of that philosophy. It's about bringing people together to have productive conversations, to find real solutions.
And he actually measures the impact of those conversations.
He does. He looks at listener interactions, new solutions being proposed, actual tangible outcomes. It's really impressive.
Wow, that's really putting your money where your mouth is. Okay, so we've established that DeBruler is all about taking action. But how does he actually approach these huge, complex problems? Let's get into the specifics of his method, because I think that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so imagine this. You're prepping for a big meeting, right?
Definitely with you.
But this isn't just any meeting. This is about tackling government corruption. And you need to get to the heart of the issue, understand it from all angles. That's where DeBruler excels.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's not just about identifying the problem, right? It's about actually implementing solutions. And that's where things often fall apart, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. But DeBruler has a unique approach. He believes in getting everyone to the table.
Okay, everyone. Even people who completely disagree.
Especially those with opposing viewpoints.
Interesting. Why is that?
He wants to break out of those echo chambers we all get stuck in, DeBruler wants to spark a real, genuine debate.
Yeah, no, I get that. Makes sense. But isn't that a recipe for disaster? Getting a bunch of people in a room who disagree?
That's where his mediator skills come in. He can create a space for disagreement, for productive disagreement.
Yeah.
And that's crucial when you're dealing with such complex issues. But it's not just about disagreeing, is it? Yeah. Ultimately, it's about finding solutions.
Right, of course. And that brings us back to the Conscious Hour and this idea of finding alternatives to war. Because it's one thing to talk about, like the financial cost of war, which is obviously huge.
Right.
But DeBruler takes it a step further, doesn't he?
He does. He talks about those hidden costs, the ones we don't always think about. The erosion of trust between nations, the shattered peace, the way these conflicts ripple outwards for generations.
It's about understanding the true weight of war, the human cost. Really heavy stuff.
It is. And to fully grasp something like that, you need a wide range of perspectives, right?
Yeah.
You need to hear from people with different experiences, different viewpoints.
And I imagine that's reflected in the guests he has on his show.
Absolutely. His potential guest list is so interesting because it's so diverse. You have economists like Jeffrey Sachs arguing for sustainable development as a path to peace. Then you have someone like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's known for being very critical of U.S. foreign policy. He brings in that military perspective.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty different perspective.
Right. And then you have journalists like Ronnie Kallick, who reports from conflict zones around the world, bringing those firsthand experiences to the table.
Wow. So you have all of these different lenses, all of these different experiences converging in one space.
Exactly. And that's what makes these conversations so potentially groundbreaking, because you never know what kind of new ideas might emerge when you bring those diverse voices together.
It's like that saying, two heads are better than one, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. And this all ties back to what makes DeBruler's approach so fascinating. Because he's not just analyzing these problems, he's actually creating a framework for finding solutions.
A framework. Okay, I like the sound of that. So what does this framework actually look like?
Well, a key part of it is this idea of tapping into the collective consciousness.
Collective consciousness? That sounds kind of, I don't know, mystical or something. What does that even mean?
It's actually not that complicated. It's this idea that solutions don't just come from, experts or academics. They can come from anyone.
So anyone can have the answer.
It's about recognizing the collective wisdom, the experiences of everyday people.
So it's about harnessing the power of the crowd, getting everyone involved in the solution.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm.
He believes that if we can create a space for open dialogue, if we can bring together diverse voices and really listen to each other, well, we might unlock solutions that we never could have imagined on our own.
Okay, I can get behind that. But how does that actually work in practice? Like on his podcast, does he just throw out a problem and let the guests go at it?
There's definitely a structure, a method to it. It's not just a free-for-all.
Okay, good, because that would be chaotic.
Exactly. The first thing he does is he strips away all the political noise, all the rhetoric, to get to the core of the issue.
It's about finding that common ground, right? That shared understanding.
Right. And once you have that, then you can start to introduce the different perspectives, the disagreements, encourage debate, challenge assumptions. But it's not about just poking holes in each other's arguments. It's about building towards something.
So there's a purpose to the conversation, an end goal in mind.
Exactly. Each episode is designed to culminate in real, actionable solutions.
Not just talking about the problem, but actually figuring out how to fix it.
Precisely. He wants listeners to walk away not only understanding the problem better, but feeling empowered, like they can actually be part of the solution.
That's awesome, because honestly, that's what's so refreshing about DeBruler's approach. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed by all the problems in the world, And it's easy to feel like there's nothing you can do about it. But he reminds us that there are solutions out there, and we all have a role to play in making them happen.
Absolutely. And that's what makes his work so compelling, especially if you're someone who actually wants to make a difference. Because he's not just offering analysis, he's offering a roadmap.
A roadmap for tackling some of the world's most pressing problems. So if we were to zoom in on this idea of finding alternatives to war, how does that actually manifest in DeBruler's work? What are some of the concrete solutions he's put forward? So if we were to zoom in on this idea of finding alternatives to war, how does that actually manifest in DeBruler's work? What are some of the concrete solutions he's put forward?
Well, one example that stands out.
Hold on a second. It's like we talked about his whole approach, his whole philosophy.
Right.
But we haven't actually heard from the guy. Like, what are some of the things he's actually advocating for? What does he want to see happen?
You're right. We need to get into some specifics. One thing he talks about a lot on the podcast is moving away from this military-first approach to foreign policy.
Okay, makes sense. So instead of always leading with military intervention, what's he suggesting?
He's really pushing for a greater emphasis on diplomacy and conflict resolution.
Okay, I can get behind that. But how do we actually make that happen? It sounds great in theory, but...
And that's where his focus on concrete action really comes in. He's talked about investing heavily in diplomatic training, for example, like really expanding those programs, making sure we have skilled diplomats who can navigate these complex situations.
So it's about giving them the tools they need to actually prevent conflict, right?
Exactly. He's also a big proponent of cultural exchange programs.
Oh, interesting.
He believes those are so important for building understanding and breaking down stereotypes between different cultures.
Yeah, that makes sense. The more we understand each other, the less likely we are to, resort to violence.
Precisely. And of course, creating more opportunities for dialogue between nations, even nations that have a history of conflict, finding ways to get them talking to each other to find common ground.
So it's about building those bridges, those lines of communication before things escalate.
Exactly. Because he argues that, if we invest in these proactive measures, these preventative measures, we can actually create a more stable and peaceful world. And the interesting thing is, it's not just about government action.
Right, because it's easy to say, oh, well, the government should just fix it, but it's obviously a lot more complicated than that.
Exactly. And that's why he talks a lot about the importance of what he calls citizen diplomacy. The idea that individuals, everyday people, have a role to play in building bridges between cultures, fostering understanding.
So it's that people-to-people connection, that grassroots effort.
Exactly. And that's what makes DeBruler's work so powerful, I think. Because it reminds us that even in the face of these huge, overwhelming problems, even when it feels like the world is falling apart.
Right. It can feel that way sometimes.
It really can.
Yeah.
But he reminds us that we're not powerless. There are concrete steps we can take, both individually and together, to actually create positive change.
And it all starts with understanding the problem, then identifying those solutions, and this is key, putting those plans into action.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond awareness into action, which, brings us back to you, the listener.
Because this isn't just about DeBruler and his ideas, it's about what we can all do.
If you were a guest on the Conscious Hour, what's the one thing you'd want to contribute to the conversation? What's that one solution that gets you fired up, the one you really believe could make a difference? It's a question worth pondering as you continue to explore these complex issues.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's not enough to just be informed.
Right. It's about taking that knowledge, that passion, and actually doing something with it.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll be inspired to start your own Conscious Hour right here in your own community.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope you'll join us next time for another fascinating discussion.